Number 10. Martin Guerre and the Return of the Wrong Husband. Some impostures seize kingdoms, others invade something even more intimate. The home, the marriage bed, the family table, the shared memory of ordinary life. The case of Martin Guerre became one of history's most haunting identity dramas because it showed how a false self can survive not only through lies, but through the strange weakness of human recognition itself. In 16th century France, Martin Guerre was a real man, a husband, and a member of a village world where identity should have been anchored by faith, kinship, property, and routine. Then he disappeared. In many stories, disappearance creates a vacancy too painful to leave empty for long. That vacancy is where the impostor entered. A man later identified as Arnaud Dutil appeared and gradually convinced much of the community that he was the returned Martin Guerre. That alone is astonishing. A village is supposed to be the place least vulnerable to false identity. Cities can be fooled by paper. Courts can be fooled by politics. But a village knows who you are, or at least it likes to believe it does. The Martin Guerre case remains so powerful because it demonstrated that even face-to-face life can be manipulated when time, longing, uncertainty, and narrative all start working in the impostor's favor. This is what made the deception so effective. The false Martin did not simply make one bold claim and wait for the world to surrender. He entered the role by degrees. He learned details. He performed memory. He inhabited relationship. In a case like this, fraud becomes more than costume. It becomes social authorship. The impostor must help write the version of reality other people can emotionally live with. If he does it well enough, their own desire to restore continuity begins assisting him. That is why the story cuts so deep. It was not merely that neighbors were fooled. It was that a wife, relatives, and an entire community became entangled in the performance long enough for doubt and acceptance to coexist in a deeply unstable balance. Every recognition became suspect. Every memory became vulnerable. The case exposed a truth far more disturbing than simple trickery. Human identity is partly made by the willingness of others to keep confirming it. The later trial gave the story its enduring historical form, because the courtroom became the stage on which recognition itself was put on trial. Witnesses contradicted each other. Some insisted the man was Martin, others were certain he was not. This confusion matters because it reveals how fragile proof can become once an impostor has been allowed to live inside a role long enough to generate real emotional history. By then, the lie is no longer external to the community. It has already become part of the community's life, and that is why Martin Guerre belongs here. The false husband did not fool the world through magical disguise or bureaucratic manipulation alone. He fooled it by stepping into a space where memory, absence, and desire had already weakened certainty from within. When the real Martin finally returned, the shock was not simply legal, it was existential. A whole village had to face the fact that the face it had accepted was not the face it thought it knew. That is the enduring terror of the case. An impostor can steal money, titles, or property. But in Martin Guerre, the deeper theft was recognition itself, and once that is stolen, everyone involved starts looking at their own certainty as if it might have belonged to the wrong man all along. Number 9. Ferdinand Waldo de Mara, the Great Impostor. Some impostors succeed by exploiting one moment of confusion. Ferdinand Waldo de Mara became legendary because he turned imposture into a way of life. He did not merely step into one false identity and cling to it. He moved from role to role with such audacity that history had to confront an almost absurd question. How many institutions can a sufficiently confident man fool before the world starts mistaking nerve for legitimacy? De Mara's career of deception unfolded across the 20th century and touched an extraordinary range of professions, settings, and identities. He posed as a monk, a teacher, a prison official, a psychologist, a law student, a surgeon, and more. The sheer variety is what made him unforgettable. Most frauds specialize. Damara treated identity itself like a field of improvisation. He seemed less interested in one fixed false self than in the intoxicating possibility that society was far more vulnerable to authority performance than it cared to admit. That is what gave his impostures their unusual force. He did not always rely on forged mastery in the narrow technical sense. He relied on composure, institutional gaps, and the astonishing tendency of organizations to trust a man who occupies a role confidently enough. This is one of the most unsettling lessons in the Damara story. Many systems are less secure than they appear because they do not verify what feels socially convincing. They verify what they expect, and Damara became expert at inhabiting expectation. The most famous episode in which he served as a ship's surgeon despite lacking legitimate medical credentials fixed him permanently in the public imagination. The story sounds almost too incredible to be true, which is exactly why it endured. Here was a man stepping into one of the most serious and technically demanding roles imaginable and performing under conditions where failure should have exposed him instantly. Yet he managed, through borrowed knowledge, remarkable self-possession, and an almost pathological willingness to attempt the impossible, to keep the deception alive far longer than common sense thinks it should. This is what makes Damara different from a simple criminal opportunist. He was not only exploiting greed or sentimental longing, he was exposing the theatre of expertise. Roles in modern society often look rigid, credentialed, and highly defended. Damara kept proving that those defences were partly symbolic. If you knew how to stand, speak, and move like the authorized person, the institution itself might help finish the illusion for you. The deeper fascination lies in motive. Money was part of survival, but not enough to fully explain the scale of reinvention. Damara seems to have been driven also by compulsion, appetite for stature, dislike of limits, and perhaps a profound inability to accept a single fixed place in the social order. In that sense, he was not just stealing identities, he was rebelling against the very idea that society should get to assign him one. And that is why he belongs on this list. Ferdinand Waldo Damara did not fool the world by pretending to be a lost prince or a returned husband. He fooled it by demonstrating again and again that modern institutions could still be seduced by bearing, confidence, and the performance of competence. His career of imposture was not a single lie. It was a running experiment in how often society mistakes the appearance of authority for the thing itself. That is what makes the great impostor more than an entertaining rogue. He was a mirror held up to professional, religious, and bureaucratic life, and the reflection was deeply embarrassing. Behind the forms, titles, uniforms, and procedures, Damara kept finding the same weakness. If the world wants the right person badly enough, sometimes it will accept the man bold enough to arrive first. Number 8. The Fox Sisters and Manufactured Spirit Voices. Some impostures seize property or titles. Others do something stranger and in some ways more powerful. They invent a doorway to the unseen and persuade the grieving, the curious, and the spiritually hungry that the dead have begun to answer back. The Fox Sisters belong to that second category. Their deception did not merely fool a household, it helped give shape to an entire movement. In the late 1840s in upstate New York, the sisters became associated with mysterious knocking sounds that were interpreted as communication from a spirit. At first, the phenomenon seemed local, eerie, and almost domestic in scale, the sort of haunting story that might have remained a regional curiosity. But the moment those sounds were framed as intelligible messages from the dead, the event crossed into something much larger. It became not just a ghost story, but a technology of hope. That is what made the Fox Sisters so historically potent. People were already prepared to believe in unseen contact. Death was close in everyday life. Religious experimentation was flourishing. Reform movements and spiritual innovation were common. In such a world, the promise that the dead might speak in simple, reproducible ways did not sound absurd. It sounded revolutionary. The sisters did not invent grief, longing, or the desire for proof of survival. They stepped into those emotions and gave them sound. This is why their case matters far beyond one family fraud. Spiritualism spread because it offered something ordinary religion often could not provide with the same immediacy. Interaction. Not only the promise that the soul survived, but the possibility that survival could be demonstrated in the room through knocks, messages, and mediums. The Fox sisters helped make that possibility socially real, and once it was real enough for enough people, the movement no longer depended entirely on whether the original manifestations were genuine. It had entered culture. The deeper unease lies in how simple the mechanism seems to have been. If spirit communication could be manufactured through bodily trickery and performed conviction, then one of the most emotionally charged religious innovations of the age was built, at least in part, on stage sound. That matters because fraud on this level does not only expose gullibility, it exposes desperation. People did not want merely to be entertained. Many wanted the lie to be true because it spoke directly to loss, mortality, and the unbearable silence left by the dead. The sisters' later confessions and reversals only deepened the ambiguity rather than erasing it cleanly. Public recantation should have ended the matter. In one sense, it did damage their credibility. But spiritualism had already become larger than its founders. That is what makes the story so darkly instructive. An imposture can outgrow the impostors. Once enough people have invested identity, belief, and emotional life into the system built around the deception, the exposure of the fraud no longer kills the movement. It becomes one more fact for the movement to reinterpret. And that is why the Fox sisters belong here. They reveal one of the most unsettling forms false identity can take, not pretending to be another person, but pretending to be a channel for another world. In doing so, they fooled not only those who wanted marvels, but those who wanted mourning to become conversation. That is what made their fraud so powerful. It wore the shape of consolation, and history is often most vulnerable to deception when the lie arrives, sounding like an answer to grief. Number 7. Arthur Orton and the Tichborne Claimant. Some impostors rely on speed, confusion, and a brief opening. Arthur Orton's success as the Tichborne Claimant became legendary because it lasted through publicity, ridicule, family division, courtroom theatre, and the astonishing willingness of large numbers of people to treat contradiction itself as proof that the right man had returned. The case began with absence, as these stories often do. Roger Tichborne, heir to a wealthy English title and estate, had been presumed lost at sea. That alone created the emotional conditions imposture needs most. Uncertainty without closure. A dead heir can be mourned. A missing heir remains available to imagination. Into that space stepped Arthur Orton, an Australian butcher of very different appearance, background and bearing, who claimed to be the long-lost Roger. On the surface, the claim should have collapsed almost instantly. The discrepancies were enormous. Orton was physically unlike the aristocratic man he purported to be. His manners, education, and memory were all vulnerable to challenge. And yet the case did not die. That is what makes it so revealing. The claimant did not survive because the evidence was strong. He survived because the story was stronger than the evidence for many who chose to believe it. This is the heart of the Tichborne affair. Identity in aristocratic society was supposed to be anchored by lineage, education, language, and class-coded behavior. Orton's claim threatened all of that by turning inheritance into a public drama in which recognition could be fought over. Some supported him out of sentiment, some out of resentment toward elites, some because the mother's acceptance of him seemed emotionally decisive, others because the sheer existence of the scandal allowed them to imagine that established authority might be wrong about one of its own. That is why the case became bigger than one fraud. It turned into a referendum on class, belief, and the cultural hunger for restoration. The claimant did not need to look exactly right if enough people wanted the aristocratic system embarrassed, or wanted a vanished son restored to his grieving mother, or wanted the spectacle of official certainty being challenged by a man everyone knew should not be able to win. In that sense, Orton's imposture succeeded because it attached itself to public appetite, not just private deception. The later trials only amplified the whole affair into one of the great identity dramas of the 19th century. Courtrooms are supposed to impose order on ambiguity, yet here the legal process became part of the spectacle. Witnesses argued memory, manner, body, class, and probability. The more absurd the claim sometimes looked, the more passionately some adherents clung to it. This is one of the most dangerous features of major impostures. Once belief becomes public identity, disproof does not always weaken it. It can harden it. And that is why Arthur Orton belongs on this list. He did not fool the world because he was a perfect imitation. He fooled much of it because perfect imitation is not always necessary. Sometimes the impostor only needs a wound history once reopened, a family desperate enough to believe, a public eager for theatre, and a social order brittle enough that challenging it becomes entertainment, ideology, and wish fulfillment all at once. That is what the Tichborne claimant exposed. The world does not always need the right man to return. Sometimes it only needs a man willing to return in the right story. Number 6. Gregor MacGregor and the Poyai fraud. Some impostors pretend to be missing heirs or forgotten men returned from the dead. Gregor MacGregor did something even more audacious. He did not merely assume another person's identity. He invented a country, gave it status, geography, authority, and promise, and persuaded respectable people to believe that an entire future was waiting for them in a place that existed mostly on paper. That is what makes the Poyai fraud one of the most extraordinary reinventions in history. MacGregor was not operating only as a liar in a back room. He was operating as a state-maker, a self-fashioned ruler, a diplomat of a false nation. He presented himself as the cacique of Poyais, a supposedly rich and welcoming territory in Central America open to settlement and investment. In an age of empire, speculation, and colonial ambition, this was exactly the kind of story the world was prepared to hear. That readiness is the key to the fraud's power. A lie succeeds best when it flatters the desires already circulating around it. Early 19th century Britain was full of people eager for overseas opportunity, land, status, profit, and the dream of starting again under favourable conditions. MacGregor did not need to invent those desires. He only needed to package them into a political fiction that looked plausible enough, exotic enough, and profitable enough to overcome caution. And he did far more than make vague claims. He built the illusion with shocking thoroughness. Maps, official-looking documents, promotional texts, land grants, bonds, and detailed descriptions of Poyais all helped create a reality dense enough for investors and settlers to step into. This is what makes the fraud so chilling. MacGregor understood that modern belief is often bureaucratic. People trust the lie more easily when it arrives with paperwork, titles, and institutional texture. He was not merely telling a story, he was manufacturing legitimacy. The human cost is what elevates the case from flamboyant fraud to real historical darkness. Settlers actually sailed out believing they were heading toward a functioning colony of opportunity. Instead, they found devastation, confusion, and conditions for which they were utterly unprepared. The promised nation was not waiting. The fantasy dissolved on contact with reality, but by then reality was lethal. Disease, exposure, hunger, and abandonment followed. The fraud had crossed from deception into physical ruin. This is why MacGregor belongs here. He showed that false identity can scale upward until it becomes geopolitical theatre. He did not simply impersonate someone important. He impersonated sovereignty itself. In doing so, he revealed how empire, finance, and ambition can all become vulnerable to fiction when fiction arrives wearing the costume of official possibility. And that is what makes Poyai so enduringly disturbing. The fraud was absurd, yes, but not in a trivial way. It was absurd in the way history often is when confidence outruns verification. Respectable people bought bonds in a country that was not what it claimed to be. Families sailed toward a future built from printed lies. MacGregor's genius, if that word can be used here, lay in understanding that the world will often believe an impossible place if the impossible place is described in the language of profit, rank, and destiny. Number 5. Princess Caraboo. Some impostors rise by claiming crowns, inheritance, or divine contact. Princess Caraboo became famous through something at once lighter and more revealing. She entered society as an exotic enigma, and people around her helped build the fantasy because they found it more exciting than the truth. In early 19th century England, a mysterious young woman appeared speaking an unknown language and presenting herself as a foreign princess from a distant land. Her manners, dress, gestures, and speech all reinforced the impression that she belonged to somewhere extraordinary and beyond immediate verification. Soon, curiosity turned into fascination. She was not just a stranger. She was a living romance dropped into provincial reality. That is what gave the Caraboo story its peculiar power. She did not exploit a legal crisis or a missing bloodline. She exploited imagination, class vanity, and the hunger for the exotic. The people around her were not merely deceived by lack of evidence. They were seduced by the pleasure of believing they had encountered something rare, noble, and culturally distant enough to make ordinary judgment feel vulgar. This is why the case matters more than it first appears to. Princess Caraboo was not simply a prank at polite society's expense. She revealed how much of identity can be granted by social performance when the audience finds the performance delightful enough. Her invented language, invented origin, and invented rank worked because they interacted with a culture already prepared to romanticize foreignness, mystery, and aristocratic charm. The fraud succeeded not in spite of social prejudice, but partly because of it. The role of class is especially important. A poor, unknown woman with strange speech might easily have been dismissed or punished. But a woman interpreted as a princess could be protected, entertained, displayed, and studied. The transformation happened because the surrounding society preferred a noble fiction to a common reality. Once she was framed as royal, people began doing the work of the imposture for her, translating oddity into prestige and uncertainty into glamour. Eventually, of course, the illusion collapsed. She was identified not as an Eastern princess, but as Mary Wilcox, an Englishwoman with a talent for improvisation and a remarkable instinct for how eagerly people would participate in their own deception. But even the exposure did not erase the fascination. The story remained because it had already revealed something embarrassing about the social world that welcomed her. Its standards of truth were softer when touched by novelty, elegance, and fantasy. And that is why Princess Caraboo belongs on this list. She did not conquer nations or seize treasuries. She did something subtler and, in its own way, just as revealing. She walked into a rigid society, offered it a fabricated wonder, and found that the gates of belief opened surprisingly easily. Her imposture reminds us that false identity does not always succeed through force or desperation. Sometimes it succeeds because the lie is simply more entertaining, more flattering, and more beautiful than the truth people would otherwise have to accept. Number 4. The man in the iron mask. Some impostors step forward and claim an identity. The man in the iron mask became legendary because the opposite happened. An identity seemed to be withheld so forcefully, so theatrically, that later generations could not stop imagining that the hidden prisoner must have been someone too dangerous, too noble, or too politically explosive to be allowed an ordinary face. The historical core is real enough. In the reign of Louis XIV, a prisoner moved through the French penal system under heavy secrecy, associated above all with the Governor Saint-Marc, and later entered cultural immortality through the image of concealed identity. Popular memory turned the covering into an iron mask, though the exact material and details are more complicated than legend prefers. But in cases like this, the object matters less than the meaning. A hidden face instantly creates a vacuum, and history rushes to fill it. That is what gives the case its extraordinary power. Prisoners are usually hidden because they are dangerous, inconvenient, or disgraced. But when concealment itself becomes part of the regime, when special measures seem designed not only to confine the body but to erase the person inside it, the logic begins to feel political in a higher register. It suggests that the prisoner did not merely commit a crime. He threatened the narrative order of the state. This is why the man in the iron mask became a magnet for false identities and substitute selves. Was he a twin of the king? A fallen noble? A servant who knew too much? A politically sensitive figure whose very name could destabilize power? The real evidence does not cleanly support the most romantic theories, and historians have worked carefully through names and records. Yet the legend survives because secrecy this dramatic invites a deeper response than documentation alone can extinguish. The prison seems to imply a hidden truth worthy of the theatrics. What makes the case fit this video is that the hidden prisoner became, in effect, a negative imposter. Later history kept trying to assign him grand identities, to reinstall beneath the mask someone important enough to justify the mystery. In this way, the case exposed the same weakness that all major impostures do. The world wants a hidden story to match the scale of the concealment. If the state behaves as though a man's identity is intolerable, then people assume the identity must be magnificent, scandalous, or dynastic. The reign of Louis XIV intensifies everything. This was a court of spectacle, hierarchy, and managed appearances, a political world built on visibility and role. To remove a person from that system so completely that even the face became a controlled object made the secrecy feel almost metaphysical. It was not just imprisonment, it was social annihilation. Once the courtly world realized a man could be held in such a condition, the hidden identity itself became more powerful than many public titles. And that is why the man in the iron mask belongs here. He was not an impostor in the ordinary sense. He became the perfect vessel for imposture after the fact, a blank identity into which generations poured kings, brothers, conspirators, and forbidden heirs. The mask did not only hide a man, it generated one of history's most fertile identity voids, and the world has been trying to put the right face behind it ever since. Number 3. Anna Anderson and the Anastasia claim. Some false identities exploit strangers. Others fasten themselves to grief so deep that exposure alone cannot dissolve them. Anna Anderson's claim to be Grand Duchess Anastasia became one of the most powerful imposture stories of the 20th century because it entered history through one of the modern world's most traumatic dynastic endings and offered people exactly what they were desperate to imagine, that one daughter of the murdered Romanovs had somehow escaped. After the Russian Revolution and the execution of the imperial family, the Romanov deaths became more than political fact. They became a wound wrapped in secrecy, rumor, incomplete evidence, and the enormous symbolic power of a dynasty destroyed in violence. In such a landscape, certainty was never emotionally easy. The idea that one child might have survived did not feel like fantasy to many people. It felt like a final human reprieve history ought to allow. That is what made Anna Anderson's claim so potent. She did not simply announce herself into an indifferent world. She appeared in a world already primed for survival narratives, hidden heirs, and unresolved mourning. Her supporters did not merely evaluate evidence. Many of them were responding to atmosphere, trauma, recognition as they wanted it to be, and the almost unbearable appeal of interrupted annihilation. If one daughter lived, then the massacre did not fully close. This is why the case lasted so long. Anderson's story did not survive because the evidence was uniformly strong. It survived because identity, memory, injury, accent, behavior, testimony, and desire all collided in unstable ways. Some who encountered her believed, others rejected the claim flatly. The dispute stretched across courts, decades, and international fascination because it was never only about one woman's body. It was about whether the Romanov tragedy had left behind a door history had failed to lock. The media age intensified everything. Anastasia already possessed the ingredients of legend, youth, beauty, lost royalty, revolutionary violence, and the dream of miraculous escape. Anderson's presence turned the legend into a living argument. Photographs, interviews, courtroom battles, and public partisanship gave the case a durability older impostures often lacked. This was not just rumor in a village or factional claim at a court. It was a modern identity war fought in public view. What gives the story its lasting force is that Anderson did not have to be a flawless imitation to remain persuasive. Trauma itself complicated recognition. Years had passed. The imperial world was gone. Exile and violence had scattered those best positioned to know. In that confusion, imperfection could be reinterpreted as damage, transformation, or the scars of survival. This is one of the deepest truths about imposture. When people need the claimant to be real badly enough, inconsistency can start looking like authenticity wounded by suffering. The later use of forensic evidence transformed the case historically, but it also revealed just how much emotional energy had once been able to survive without it. Before science closed the biological question far more decisively, whole decades had been lived inside the argument. That matters. It means Anderson's power came not from proof alone, but from the world's willingness to keep the Romanov dead slightly open to revision. And that is why Anna Anderson belongs this high on the list. She did not merely impersonate a princess. She stepped into the shattered afterlife of a fallen empire and offered it the single lie many people most wanted to hear, that one child had made it through. The claim endured because it gave grief a face, gave legend a body, and gave history one more chance to pretend that total destruction had somehow spared a single name. Number 2. Perkin Warbeck. Some impostors succeed by slipping into private grief. Others become dangerous because they step directly into the bloodstream of dynastic crisis and offer a kingdom the one thing it fears most, the return of a rightful heir it cannot safely dismiss. Perkin Warbeck became one of the greatest impostors in European history because he did not merely claim noble blood. He claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the vanished princes in the Tower. That claim gave him extraordinary power from the beginning. The disappearance of the princes had already left England with one of its deepest royal wounds. Their fate was uncertain enough and politically explosive enough that any convincing survivor would immediately become more than a curiosity. He would become a threat to the legitimacy of those who had ruled after them. That is exactly the opening Warbeck exploited. What made the deception so formidable was not that it was obviously airtight. It was that it arrived in a world already primed to use it. Late 15th century England was still unstable after dynastic conflict. Henry VII's hold on power, though strengthening, still had vulnerabilities. Yorkist loyalty had not disappeared. Foreign rulers had every incentive to support any claimant who could weaken Tudor security. In that environment, a pretender did not need universal proof. He needed enough plausibility to function as a political weapon. That is what turned Warbeck from an adventurer into a continental problem. He gained recognition, backing, and ceremonial treatment from important courts abroad. He was received not merely as a fraud shouting in the street, but as a figure powerful people found useful to acknowledge. This is one of the most revealing things about imposture at the level of monarchy. The claimant's identity is only part of the story. The other part is who benefits from treating the claimant as real. Warbeck also understood performance. A prince is not only lineage, a prince's bearing, language, composure, the ability to inhabit expectation. In courts especially, identity often survives through ritual confirmation. Once people of rank begin treating a man as royal, the appearance of royalty starts thickening around him. That does not make the claim true, but it makes it socially potent. Warbeck's talent lay not only in asserting who he was, but in continuing to behave as though the role already belonged to him. This is why he remained dangerous for so long. He forced Henry VII into the unpleasant position every ruler dreads, having to crush a claim in a way that proves the claimant matters. Ignore him, and he grows. Attack him too hard, and you advertise your own insecurity. Warbeck's mere existence exposed how fragile legitimacy can feel when a vanished bloodline is suddenly given a body again. His eventual downfall did not erase the fascination. Once captured and forced back into the realm of ordinary humanity, he ceased to be politically viable. But the story remained because it had touched something far older and darker than one ambitious man. It had reopened the unresolved horror of the princes and shown how easily an unclosed dynastic wound can become a launching point for reinvention, rebellion, and international intrigue. And that is why Perkin Warbeck belongs at number 2. He did not fool the world by inventing a prince from nothing. He fooled enough of it by becoming the prince history had never fully buried. In doing so, he proved that the most powerful false identity is often not the one with the best evidence. It is the one that fits a vacancy too dangerous for the age to leave empty. Number 1, false Dmitry I. Some impostors fool families. Some fool courts. False Dmitry I stands at number 1 because he did something almost no impostor ever manages to do at the highest level. He did not merely claim a throne, he reached it. In the early 17th century, Russia was already moving through one of the most unstable periods in its history, the time of troubles. Famine, dynastic uncertainty, elite rivalry, foreign intervention, and the long shadow of Ivan the Terrible had left the state dangerously exposed. In such a climate, legitimacy itself becomes fragile. That is exactly when imposture becomes most explosive, because the question, who truly has the right to rule, stops being theoretical and becomes a weapon. The man known to history as False Dmitry claimed to be Dmitry Ivanovich, the younger son of Ivan the Terrible, long believed dead under suspicious circumstances. That claim was perfect in the most dangerous way. A missing or ambiguously dead royal child creates a hole in history that later politics can inhabit. If the boy truly died, then the claimant is a fraud. But if even a fraction of uncertainty remains, then the claimant carries a charge no ordinary pretender can match. He is not merely asking for power, he is asking the realm to admit it buried the wrong future. That is what gave False Dmitry his extraordinary force. He emerged not as a random liar, but as an answer to a wound already present in Russian political memory. And because the time of troubles had weakened confidence in existing authority, people were prepared to listen. Nobles, enemies of the current regime, foreign supporters, and populations hungry for resolution all found reasons to entertain his claim. He did not need every person to believe in him equally. He needed enough people to believe that his existence changed the game. And it did. What makes him number 1 is that imposture here was not symbolic alone. It became sovereign. False Dmitry entered Moscow and was crowned Tsar. That fact alone lifts the case above almost every other example on this list. Most impostors are ultimately contained by the structures they challenge. This one passed through the gates of power and sat inside the office his identity claimed. For a time, the lie, if lie it was, became government. This is what makes the case so historically devastating. Once an impostor rules, every institution around him must decide whether to recognize, resist, exploit, or survive him. The fraud, or the miracle, whichever one believes it to be, stops being a story at the edges. It becomes the center of public life. Laws, alliances, rituals, and obedience all begin circulating around a man whose very self is under dispute. At that point, the imposture exposes something larger than gullibility. It exposes the terrifying truth that states themselves can be forced to operate inside uncertainty if the crisis is deep enough. His later overthrow and death only intensified the legend. False Dmitry was killed, his body desecrated, and his memory targeted for obliteration. But that destruction did not end the pattern. More false Dmitrys followed. That is perhaps the most telling detail of all. Once one impostor had shown that the vacancy could be inhabited, the role itself became reusable. Russia had discovered that dynastic uncertainty could generate not just one counterfeit sovereign, but a whole series of them. And that is why false Dmitry I stands at number 1. He represents the most dangerous form imposture can take, not a false identity seeking entry into history, but a false identity powerful enough to briefly become history. He fooled the world because the world, or at least enough of it, was broken enough to need him, use him, and obey him. That is the final horror of the case. An impostor becomes truly lethal not when he persuades people he is someone else. He becomes lethal when a collapsing age finds it easier to crown him than to face the void his claim has opened.